This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. He was the George Washington of the teaching profession. He helped found modern teacher unionism. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma. He was denounced as a racist and a thug when he shut down the New York City school system in 1967 and 1968. And he became the nation's leading educational reformer, concerned with student standards, teacher assessments, school choice, merit pay, which are as current today as they were when he addressed them a quarter century ago. He's Albert Shanker, and here to talk about him and the issues that he confronted and that we still confront is Richard Kahlenberg, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. He is the author of 4 books and dozens of articles and reviews on education, equal opportunity, and civil rights. His latest book is Tough Liberal, Albert Shanker and the Battle Over Schools, Unions, Race, and Democracy. Welcome, Richard.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Doug.
Some really provocative and intriguing reading. Now, whenever I think of Albert Shanker, I think of what you open your book on, and that is Woody Allen's 1973 movie Sleeper, when Allen's character wakes up 200 years later and finds out that there was a major war and that civilization had been destroyed, and the response was a man named Albert Shanker got a hold of a nuclear warhead, which really stung Shanker because he used that quote a lot of times. Why did Woody Allen pick on Albert Shanker?
Well, he saw Albert Shanker as kind of a madman because of what he'd done in New York City in 1967, 1968.
The Ocean Hill-Brownsville.
Ocean Hill-Brownsville, right. Al Shanker shut down the New York public schools, not for a couple of days, but for weeks at a time. I think history will suggest that he did the right thing. In Ocean Hill-Brownsville, there was a group that were animated by kind of the Black Power movement that wanted to fire white teachers without any due process. And to my mind, Al Shanker was right to stand up for that.
And this still resonates. I mean, I was a former New York City public school teacher and still in contact. I mean, that controversy reverberates and resonates even to the current day.
Yes. No, when you talk about Ocean Hill-Brownsville with New Yorkers who lived through it, it was like a domestic Vietnam. I mean, brother against sister. Liberals were completely divided. That's what made it interesting, because you had, and on the one hand, you had a group of liberals who were concerned about the plight of black children and wanted to try something different, and so that's completely understandable. But then there was another group of liberals, the ones who I think were on the right side of history, who said, yes, we need to do much better by African American children, but the way to go about that is not to fire white teachers, it's to provide more resources, decrease segregation. There are a lot of things we can do, but going and violating the union contract and saying that teachers didn't have rights, it didn't make sense.
Yeah, and as I said, it still leads to incendiary conversations in New York 40 some odd years later.
It's as if it happened yesterday.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, those of us who lived through it, really was a profoundly disturbing, disorienting phenomenon. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think it was a turning point for American liberalism in many ways. I mean, you had people who historically had supported school integration and the rights of unions and the idea that people shouldn't be hired or fired based on race, and suddenly all those consensus points were upended in Ocean Hill-Brownsville. And so I think it was a profound moment in our history.
And the portrait that you paint of Albert Shanker is of this very complex, complicated guy. He was a firebrand and union militant on one hand. He's a forward-looking educational reformer and intellectual on the other hand, who wrote thousands of columns in the New York Times. One of my, every week we read Albert Shanker's column. And so he sort of married ideas and power and idealism and pragmatism, and then still remains in many ways a flashpoint, as we've just discussed. Okay.
That's right.
Let's move to his next strike, which is in 1975, a strike that he loses, a strike that I've told you. I was a UFT chapter chairman and led my building in the September 9th strike against the board. Talk about that strike and the context of that strike and the impact of that strike.
Right. Well, in 1975, of course, New York City was going through its worst fiscal crisis ever. And it was, they were going to Congress to try to get a bailout. But they couldn't get that. And so teachers were being laid off left and right.
15,000, yes. Of which I was one.
That's right. And class, for the teachers who remained, it wasn't a picnic either, because class sizes ballooned, and it was a moment when clearly teachers were looking to their leaders to do more. And Shanker was actually resistant to the idea of going on strike because he thought there just isn't any money. We can't save all these jobs. But Shanker turned out to be a hero of sorts.
Yes.
Because he agreed to invest the pension money of New York City teachers in bonds. And
he was reluctant to do it. I mean, he was really, because he felt that it was fiduciary, an irresponsible act. And also, I think he understood the power involved in it.
That's right. And it turned out that in the long run, that was a great investment for the teachers.
That's right. That's right. And even though Ford did not quite say drop dead, the feds made money on us as well. And in fact, Shanker during that, in the aftermath of the strike, went back to that Woody Allen quote and said, "I had the nuclear bomb and I didn't use it."
Drop it. Right.
And it really got under his skin. Now, but at the same time, he was this liberal who believed in, sort of integration, colorblindness, nonviolence. He really became associated with what is now sort of a conservative political agenda. High standards, teacher accountability, charter schools, some form of merit pay. So he's not easy to pigeonhole as an unreconstructed liberal.
Yeah, well, that's why I titled the book Tough Liberal.
Right.
Because on the one hand, he was foursquare in favor of the central mechanisms in our society for promoting social mobility. He was a liberal on public schools and was a strong opponent of private school vouchers. He was a liberal on trade unionism and believed strongly we needed to reform the laws so that people could unionize in this country. And at the same time, on foreign policy, he was a hawk. And on the question of racial
and
preferences.
wrong on the issue of Vietnam. I mean, in the eyes of many of us. Did he come to realize the error of his ways on Vietnam, or did he remain committed to that view?
There was no time in which he publicly said, "I was wrong on Vietnam." I think he was wrong, but I understand where he was coming from. He was not a conservative who was saying, America, right or wrong, we've got to be for this war. Instead, his position was that the North Vietnamese communists were destroying labor unions, free labor unions in Vietnam, and that something had to be done about that. And so he was, if you will, he was for a conservative policy for liberal reasons.
Okay. And he saw unionism and trade unionism as a fundamental pillar of American democracy. Talk about that.
Absolutely. And that's what combines these various positions. Support for public schools, support for trade unions, opposition to communism, and also opposition to racial preferences. What tied that all together was a commitment to democracy. And so, to take your example of unions, he felt that unions were critical, free trade unions were critical in any democracy, in part to democratize the workforce so that workers had a say in what happened in the workforce, but also to make sure that in the Congress, the voice of working people, middle class, regular people was heard. And if you didn't have an organization, if you didn't have the AFL-CIO in there representing regular people, that corporate interests would dominate the Congress. And that's pretty much where we are today.
And his argument was really strengthened in Poland in the early 1980s when it was Lech Walesa and the Union movement that really begins to deconstruct the communist regime in Poland.
That's right. So he cited the irony because Shanker and Ronald Reagan lied on the question of trade unions in Poland. They both saw them as a source of freedom and an independent organization that could resist the power of the government. But domestically, of course, they clashed. Reagan lost his appreciation for unions when it came to the United States.
And also fired how many air traffic controllers in Patco, which really is one of these inflection points in history, and certainly is demonstrated as a point at which unionism began to decline dramatically in the United States.
That's right.
Or attitudes towards unions.
Yes, and Shanker wrote about the Patco firings. I mean, it was, in the past, employers had said, if you go on strike, we'll work it out and we'll bring you back, ultimately. But after Reagan just out and out fired the air traffic controllers, that set a different tone, and corporate America became much more aggressive and fired people who were going out to strike, which is a legal right in this country. And they also...
Except for public employees in a lot of jurisdictions, certainly in New York State with the Taylor law, you can't do it.
That's right. Although what Shanker showed is that you could engage in what he called civil disobedience. So his strikes were illegal, the strikes that he led, but he went to jail, paid the price, and it strengthened the union movement.
Very much along the philosophical lines of a Martin Luther King, for example.
That's right.
Okay. Let's go to today and sort of the transition into some of those major issues that Shanker was dealing with. One of your pieces that you do annually is the best and worst in education. Let's start with the best and worst in education in 2011. What was the worst?
Well, I think the worst was the attack on public employee unions, including teachers' unions centrally, in places like Wisconsin, Ohio, where you had Republicans who were worried about the political power of public employee unions seeking to crush them. One of the pieces of good news is related to the same topic, which is the vote in Ohio in November of 2011.
And you have an upcoming recall election in Wisconsin for Governor Scott Walker. Do you have any insight into that battle?
Well, I haven't followed that closely, but it certainly, if Ohio is any indicator, there by 2 to 1, people supported the notion that public employees have a basic right to bargain collectively and pursue their interests. And so to the extent that Walker stands for gutting that right, he's got some trouble ahead.
Is the law of perverse consequences operating here? You produce the very opposite of what you intend. Has this in fact strengthened unionism in the United States to any significant degree?
Well, I think what it did is it certainly woke up liberals, because liberals always assumed that basically you have this right to collective bargaining, both in the public and private sector, and so we're going to focus on other issues, the environment, civil rights, other important issues. But now the basic right to bargain collectively is at stake, and so I think it could end up ironically energizing the labor movement in a way that it hasn't been energized in years.
Republicans are sort of the focal point in this argument, but it's not only Republicans that have assaulted teachers' unions in particular, liberals too, or former liberals. You in one of your articles, I guess in American Educator talked about this bipartisan, really, assault on unions, particularly teachers' unions.
Well, I think it's very troubling. I mean, you have the film that was basically an attack on teachers' unions, Waiting for Superman. It's directed by a liberal Democrat. You had in Washington, D.C., a liberal Democratic mayor who appointed Michelle Rhee, who became an anti-union advocate.
You're not a big fan of Michelle Rhee.
No, not at all. And even Barack Obama, I have to say, I'm a big supporter of his in most issues, but he went in and said in Central Falls, Rhode Island, that an effort to fire every single teacher in a high school was justified. And I mean, so the fact that math and test scores weren't what they should be means that the PE teacher should be fired. I mean, it was an overkill, but it's part of this sense of that many people have. Education isn't working. What can we do? What's an easy thing to do? Just fire the teachers, and that's not going to work.
Politically, I mean, just sticking on this national level in Obama, is he in trouble? I mean, do teachers' unions have a real choice in a presidential election between Barack Obama and any of the Republicans, let's say Mitt Romney?
Well,
or do they stay home?
No,
or not staff phone banks? They don't have an option, do they?
No, they don't have. I mean, clearly someone like Mitt Romney would be much worse for teachers' unions than Barack Obama. I mean, Barack Obama is a basic supporter of public schools. He believes in the right to unionize. And so on fundamental issues, he's in good shape. But the question is whether teachers will be motivated. I mean, in some elections, they can be pivotal in getting the vote out, manning phone banks, and also being leaders in the community. I mean, teachers in a lot of communities are among the best educated individuals, and they can, if they get behind a candidate, can have a big impact.
But unions can be a problem too. They can be obstructionist. I mean, yes, in the mid-'70s I was a member of the UFT, but in the '90s I was a Northern New Jersey school board member and negotiated with unions on health care and pensions, etc. And many times I felt like reaching across the table and literally choking them. So unions can be obstructionists. They can thwart innovation. They can harm local districts in terms of their economic wants and needs.
Well, I think there's no doubt that in some instances teachers' unions go too far. But the Al Shanker story suggests you can be a strong union advocate and an education reformer at the same time.
Do we have Albert Shankers out there in the teachers' unions in the United States?
Well, I think Randy Weingarten is very much following in Al Shanker's tradition. So Al Shanker, for example, admitted there are some lousy teachers in the profession.
And he said it a lot.
Who need to be fired.
Right.
Now, when his wife Edie said, how can you write that in your column, that there are these lousy teachers? His response was, well, no teacher thinks I'm talking about them.
Right.
So, but he was willing to admit that and to say some teachers are better than others and should be paid differently if there's a fair procedure put in place. And he, very importantly, was for the concept of peer review, which they have in places like Toledo and Montgomery County, Maryland, where teachers are involved in working with their struggling colleagues, those who aren't performing up to par. They try to improve their performance, but then if they just doesn't work out, they recommend that the teacher be fired. Now this is unusual. I mean, you have a union involved in recommending the firing of some of their members. So it was revolutionary at the time, but Shanker said, if we want to save public education, we have to put the interests of students on par with those of teachers.
And turning now locally to New York City and New York State, we had a couple of weeks ago, the mayor of the city of New York laying out a very aggressive attack against teachers' unions with Mike Mulgrew, the head of the UFT, in the audience. Andrew Cuomo, the governor, in his State of the State message, is tying state aid to the formulation of a teacher evaluation system. And, we've got conflict here. So clearly, you've got issues of teacher evaluations, you've got merit pay, you've got school restructuring. These issues aren't going away. Talk about what might be an appropriate teacher evaluation model, and are there models out there? Are there best practices out there?
Yes, well, I think there are a number of communities that are grappling with this issue. I mean, one of the things that Shanker emphasized, and I think is still true today, is that any evaluation system has to give an incentive for teachers to cooperate with one another. So if you have a limited pot of money and teachers are fighting over that small amount of money, who's going to get the bonus? That would be a disaster for education, because the last thing we want is to have the effective teacher who knows how to teach the French Revolution in a brilliant fashion, saying, well, I'm not going to share that idea with my colleague because otherwise I might lose out on my bonus. So Shanker and others argued...
How real do you think that is actually in the lunchroom and in the classroom?
Oh, if people are in tough economic times now, I think if they feel as though they're not going to, there's a small amount of money and they're going to have to fight over it, that represents the wrong direction. Now, there are ways to reward merit that recognize, or can actually encourage sharing. And,
Talk to me.
And that's if you do it on a school-wide basis, in part at least, so that if a school, the teachers in a school come together and all of them work together and improve performance, they get extra money. And that can be part of the...
my economics professor would say that there's a real free rider problem here, because your good teachers are going to do it and your not so good teachers are not going to do it, and therefore you've got conflict that you've talked about before. So I don't know if you get out of that conflict.
Except then there's some pressure placed on the free riders. Well, listen, you've got to help us. You've got to improve your performance.
But don't you need an evaluation system that would allow you to determine who are the good ones and who? Yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem. I how do you develop the evaluation system?
Yes, that's right. No, I think we wouldn't want to necessarily leave it with only school-wide gains being measured. Individual gains would matter. But I think it's important that the school-wide gains count at least as much as the individual gains. I mean, the countries that beat us year after year internationally do not have this individualized compensation system, merit pay system. They have all sorts of incentives for teachers to cooperate, and that's important.
Without that framework, though, that putting in merit pay could have deleterious consequences as well, though.
Right. I think well, that's the point. If you look at places like Finland that beats the rest of the world, I mean, the reason that these schools do better is that they have clear standards of what students should know and be able to do. They deal with the important outside of school issues, the poverty level, and they deal with this issue that we don't talk about much anymore, which is segregation. I mean, our schools are increasingly segregated by economic status.
Right, class.
And so we have done very little in this country to address the fact that poverty concentrations almost always lead to bad educational results.
How should we evaluate teachers' performance vis-a-vis students? I mean, what is the role of standardized testing? What are the benefits of standardized testing? Right. And what are the pitfalls of standardized testing as part of a teacher evaluation system? I mean, I can understand almost if you do it exclusively, but as part of a process.
Mm-hmm. I think there is a role for standardized tests as a piece of the larger evaluation system for teachers. One of the things that Shanker talked about, though, was that you needed incentives for both students and for teachers. So under the No Child Left Behind Act, for example, there are no incentives for students to do well. In fact, what the message of No Child Left Behind is, if you do poorly on this test, you're not going to be punished. We're going to punish your teacher. Well, what sort of incentive system is that? That doesn't make any sense. So instead of simply having stakes for teachers, I think we need it for students, for principals, and across the board.
Talk more generally about No Child Left Behind, both its strengths and its weaknesses. And let me pose a hypothetical. Barack Obama wins the 2012 election, leaves, as Secretary of Education, names you Secretary of Education. You like the job. Yeah, right. You like it. What do you tell him? What ought to be the priorities? What ought to be the thrust of what you see to be an enlightened national policy toward education?
Yeah. Well, I think the fundamental problem that we have today is that there is a focus on demonizing teachers and teachers' unions, as if that is the major problem in our education system. Well, we have, in fact, lots of evidence of what happens when you have weak teachers' unions. In the charter school movement, 88% of the charter schools are not unionized. And yet the performance, in the American South, that's the other one. And the performance is quite abysmal for the most part. And so that suggests maybe we should reorder our thinking and focus on the things that really matter a lot: poverty and economic segregation. And specifically in the latter area, what we can do is provide financial incentives for middle-class schools to take in some low-income students.
Okay, and that's the thesis of your book altogether now, Creating Middle-Class Schools Through Public School Choice. One of the things that interested me and also raised some questions are there enough middle-class schools to deal with those folks who need that education?
Absolutely. I mean, this idea of trying to deconcentrate poverty won't work everywhere. But we're still a middle-class country predominantly. And we're still a country where you can have many more of our public schools have a majority of students who are middle class with a substantial minority.
How do you do this practically? Don't you run into the problem that you had with desegregation or integration by busing?
Right. Well, we've learned a lot about how to integrate schools since kind of the controversies of the 1970s. In the 70s, they integrated schools through compulsory busing, gave parents no choice in the matter. You live here, your kids are going over there. Of course, there was a huge backlash to that. And so what we've learned is that you have to have positive incentives. So magnet schools can be located in tougher neighborhoods. If you've got a particular pedagogical approach, if you have a Montessori school that upper middle class whites are wild about, they will travel, their kids will travel further because what's at the end of the bus ride is something that's attractive.
Sure.
And likewise, if you provide a financial incentive for middle class schools to take in some low income students, some money that can be used for all the students in that school, then you can see that happen voluntarily as opposed to in a compulsory
Likely?
fashion. Oh, if the money is there, the whole Race to the Top federal program, which provided money if states do X, Y, and Z, was fabulously successful in changing the behavior of states. So charter school caps were lifted in a number of states. Merit pay plans were put in place because there were federal dollars that were associated
So
with it.
money really is still very important in this process.
Absolutely, and it's an incentive that can bring about more integration than we have today.
Last question. Is it likely that there's going to be more money given the perilous economic times that we're in, or are we trapped in this?
Yeah, well, in the very near future, there isn't more money, that's clear. But over the long term, we have to restructure the way we spend education money so that we do things that have been proven to work. I mean, there's 50 years of research to suggest that a low-income student will do much better in a middle-class school, and yet we've ignored that basic reality.
My thanks to Richard Kahlenberg for being on the show. See you next week on CUNY TV. Somewhat optimistic, but not totally so.
Right. That's right. Well, I'd like to be a tough liberal on this one.
Okay, thank you. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.